Hey everybody, Brian here. This is the second video in my new series on how to go about using the idea of musical layers in your music production. Kind of like how professional arrangers and orchestrators use layers. In the first video, which I highly recommend you check out, otherwise a lot of stuff in this video is not going to make sense, I introduced you to the idea of musical layers and how in most music we see up to 3 layers, so say a background, middle ground, foreground. Of course you could also have 2, 1. So in this video we're going to take that same exact idea and show you how to visualize your musical layers in a DAW. I'm showing you how to do this in Logic, but it doesn't really matter. Any DAW can support this. And ultimately, you're going to become like an architect who can look at a blueprint and understand every little aspect of the design at the low level to the high level. In this case, the visualization of your music in the DAW is going to be like your blueprint. And especially today with AI posing such a huge threat to music, you'll probably agree this is probably the most catastrophic, talentless period of music production in musical history because of AI. So we're going to take a totally different approach. What I'm presenting you here is kind of like an anti-venom to AI, where we're going to apply human rigor to our music production. So hopefully you have the time, the discipline, and the passion to check this out. This isn't a TikTok video kind of nonsense or YouTube short. This is pretty serious stuff. So let's see what it's like to be human with music production.
That's what he does! That's all he does! You can't stop him!
Alright, here I am in Logic, and it doesn't matter what DAW you have, everything I talk about in this video will apply pretty much. So let me first talk about the typical approach people use when it comes to color coding their music in a DAW before I go on to talk about why my method is so powerful and preferable. So typically you have your different types of instruments and people will group them together in folders or whatever and then color code them. So here I have a pretty complex project, not super complex, but a good number of tracks. It's an instrumental piece. There's a guitar, there's some synth lead parts, some synth brassy kind of parts, pad type of instruments, some plucks like piano and some bells. There's some rhythmic sequence kind of instruments, various bass instruments, drums and percussion, some FX. So what does this tell us about the music?
What's that make us?
Absolutely nothing!
Well, I guess I can kind of see that maybe this lead guitar part is the main melody. I can see there are some pad parts that play pretty often, some plucks, these rhythmic pieces, the bass, etc. But this doesn't really tell me anything about the actual musical structure. I mean, I can't tell which other instruments might be doubling up on this melody. I can't tell if there's maybe a countermelody going on, and which instruments might be doubling up on that countermelody. I can't see when these pads are playing different types of roles other than just long sustained pads. They might be doing some other stuff. Same with the plucks. I don't know exactly what these piano and bell parts are doing. Bass and drums tends to be fairly straightforward. But when it comes to things like melody, harmony, countermelodies, you really want to be able to see that in the music in a big picture because it helps you cue in on important parts of the music that also drives mix decisions. You know, with this kind of coloring, granted, you could zoom in vertically to the point where you start seeing some musical notes and scroll horizontally. In this case, I'm lucky because I actually have a MIDI version of this lead guitar melody. So I could look here and try to figure out, okay, maybe there's some parts here that are being doubled by something. But when you do all that kind of zooming, you're losing track of that big picture. And so it's very unwieldy having to always be doing these kind of zooms just to figure out what the hell's going on in your music. So that's why I'm trying to transfer the whole idea of when you use an actual printed score to see structure and how we can do something similar in the DAW. So that's a little bit of motivation behind why this kind of typical color coding scheme is fairly useless actually. Ultimately, what we're going to want to end up with is something like this. And I know at first this is going to seem really like visual noise. What the hell's going on here? What's the point? But just bear with me, watch the whole video, and once you start applying this kind of approach to the music, you'll never go back because this approach is going to give you total mastery of your music at every single level, and it also helps greatly with mix decisions. Now, in the first video in the series, I talked about my color coding scheme and I also talked about how this isn't science. I came up with this based on my experiences with analyzing music, producing music, and so feel free to mix this up, do it however makes sense to you. So in my case, I'm using red to denote main melody kind of lines. Yellow is where I have countermelody going on. And sometimes it's tough to determine when something's a countermelody versus riffs or something. But in this case, it's a well-formed idea that tends to repeat and stand out as a real countermelody. Then also music tends to have fills and flourishes, riffs, that kind of stuff. So that's going to be this pinkish color. And these things often happen during transition points. So they act as connective tissue between musical sections. So a verse or chorus, section A or section B, etc. You often see things like pads or long sustained notes. And of course, you have things like rhythm guitar, piano, rhythmic strings, brass, etc., etc. These tend to be harmonic in nature, and they're very rhythmic. So if there's a bass line or drums, these tend to be very tightly integrated. And then FX. I'll talk about shading a little later. Don't worry about that for now. And now it's important for me to say these colors don't mean they are layers. Layers come about based on how these different musical functions are integrated. So a main melody does tend to be its own layer. A countermelody also tends to be its own layer, but there can be other parts that might be supporting a melody or countermelody. They might be supporting more of the rhythmic harmony, fills for instance. Things that are integrated really tightly in terms of rhythmic and harmony, those are often felt as one layer. We often talk about rhythm sections in modern music, so drums, bass, guitar, piano, all that kind of stuff. With any kind of music, doesn't matter, you can think of that same idea. So you tend to have a foreground, which could be the main melody. You tend to have a background, which is your bass, drums, other kind of rhythm and harmonic support. And then you could have a middle ground layer, which could be your counter melody, or fills and flourishes if they're really prominent in the music. Anyway, my first video gets into great detail on how to think about layers, identify them, define them. So this is just a quick overview of what I talked about in terms of this color coding in that first video. So I'm going to show you how this looks on the score, just to give you some extra motivation on how we're arriving at this kind of thought process, this kind of coloring scheme. Now I'm in Steinberg Dorico. And this video series doesn't require that you be able to read music. I know a lot of people get afraid when they see musical notation like this, but don't be afraid, don't get spooked by this. I'm just going to talk conceptually about how arrangers and orchestrators can gather a ton of musical information just from looking at this kind of version of music, and how we're going to do something similar in the DAW afterwards. So this particular piece of music is something that I wrote to go along with a family video from when we took a trip to the New Hampshire seacoast recently. That was a nice break from Moscow, the one in Russia, not the one in Idaho. So looking at this, I can see various types of musical functions. I can see here's a melody part, and then some other part, and I happen to know this is a counter melody. So I can see how these things evolve. I can see where counter melody parts start getting doubled up. Here again are some counter melody lines. I can see them being doubled up at times. I can see how the main melody is also doubled up at times. And likewise, throughout the entire piece, just because I've experienced looking at and analyzing printed music, I can quickly see musical structure here. I don't have to do a lot of zooming in and out. It just becomes apparent. And professional arrangers and orchestrators are so used to looking at music where they immediately see the structure of the music. Melodically, harmonically, counter-melodically, rhythmically, etc. And at the end of the video, you're going to see how we can apply that same kind of idea. So even if you have no experience with written music, in your DAW, you're going to be able to think like a professional arranger and orchestrator, which is definitely going to take your music to the next level because of the control and mastery you're going to have of your music. Now that I've talked about how arrangers and orchestrators go about using their mastery of musical layers and functions to guide their music production, we're going to look at this piece of music that I produced here, and I'm going to talk about all of the arranging decisions I made, how I was applying the idea of musical function and layers, and how we can visualize that in the DAW. So this piece starts out with a melodic statement and counter melody as well. So at first it's just two layers. There's nothing else going on. Also the melody is at a higher pitch than the counter melody, which helps give those separation to the listener, making them stand out as two distinct layers. So that's what I'm depicting here in the DAW as well with this coloring, based on the coloring scheme that I just talked about. So two layers here, a melody and a counter melody. And then this intro evolves a little bit, becoming three layers, where we have the melody, counter melody. By the way, this counter melody now becomes doubled up an octave. And then some pads come in. So three layers there being melody, counter melody, and the pads. That's what I'm showing here. And notice how this particular yellow is a little brighter than this one. It might be tough for you to see that on your monitor. That's because I like to have the brightest colors be the highest pitch register, especially when we're talking about things like double parts or harmonized parts. So this part is 1 octave above the brass synth playing that Countermelody. So I like to see that visually because it kind of helps me hone in on various pitch registers in the music, and that can drive certain kind of mix decisions. And it also helps with multi-part editing. So with this kind of color coding, and I click here, see what's going on in the piano roll. And then I can add this MIDI to it by hitting Shift and clicking that track. So there I see this lower pitch register part. Here's the higher part, brighter in yellow than this part. So it's pretty useful to be able to track that kind of stuff as you're editing. You know, even though we added that Countermelody up an octave from the main Countermelody, it's still below the main melodic lines. So we're observing that good arranging principle of ensuring separation between melodic elements. And then during these next 3 bars here, it's kind of a transition as we're going back to that main melodic statement of this intro. We're seeing more pads come in, as well as a riff idea and some bells. And this is a good principle in arranging, introducing a new idea that's different in its melodic harmonic content, as well as its rhythmic content. So these bells are a different type of articulation than what we saw previous, and it also has a rhythmic idea that we haven't seen. Countermelody drops out at that point, which is a good arranging technique. You don't always want to have the same thing happening. So as I have more activity in the pads, and where this bell riff is introduced, that's where I drop out the Countermelody. And so we have good contrast in these transition bars so that when the Countermelody picks up again, there's more contrast. And at some points we have 4 pads playing, and so my color coding tells me what are the highest parts, what are the lowest parts. Again, that's not super critical, but I do find it very useful to get an idea of what's going on in terms of pitch registers when it comes to integrated kind of parts, like a string section or woodwinds or something. Like I showed you earlier, we could click on these in the editor, and we see that separation from the lowest to the highest. I should also point out when it comes to simultaneously sounding notes, you typically want to have your lower notes more spaced than higher notes. So that's a pretty typical principle in voice leading and arranging. So notice these high notes are more closely spaced than these low notes. Because if you have low notes that are too closely spaced, they tend to start sounding mushy. Those intervals don't work that well. Whereas here you could have high notes spaced by a whole step, and that still works. So I'll play up to this point so you can hear the evolution of these layers and also see if you agree that your ear's also sensing this in the way I am, or maybe you're sensing it in a different way. So we have these transition bars, which are also 3 layers, in this case melody, pads, and this bell riff. And then at bar 12, there's a repeat of that intro melody. And here things start growing in terms of the arrangement. Now we're seeing 3 instruments playing on a Countermelody. We have this choir part, these bell hits. They're kind of supporting the overall rhythmic harmony section, so along with the bass that's now come in, percussion comes in. So at this point, we're 3 layers with the melody, the Countermelody, and then these pads, bass, percussion playing this overall harmonic rhythmic support kind of role. And then this intro ends with a melodic statement. So towards this point, we see the Countermelody drop out, pads thinning out, that choir and bells part also dropping out. Percussion drops out, and then what we have instead are 4 instruments basically playing this melodic statement that's going to lead to the main section of the piece, like your verse. So at this point we're down to 2 layers, the melodic statement plus the bass. Then finally, right before this main melody starts, there are a few additional transition bars. So here, most instruments drop out, and we have these rhythmic bell kind of riffs in the piano and the synth bell instrument, along with a bass drone. There's a little bit of guitar here, but it's more just for atmospherics, as well as some percussion kind of effects. But in general here, I'm looking at 2 layers, these rhythmic melodic bells and the bass. And again, I'm using color coding since the piano is playing higher in pitch than these bells here. Now if we look at these first 22 bars leading up to the main melody, you can see the evolution here. You can see where things are growing, diminishing, gradually more and more bell, mallet kind of hits coming in. And then right before the main melody starts, we see a complete drop in the arrangement complexity, which is a good way to add contrast. And because I wrote this to go along with a family video, a lot of the arrangement decisions were based on my desire to have the music fit with the visuals. So that calm, serene, kind of on the water feel. So right away, we have a good architectural view of things, quite a bit better than what we were looking at originally. If we use a typical approach that people use in DAWs with coloring the tracks, we don't see any musical structure here. You'll probably agree this is a far better way to organize your music, even if at first you're not accustomed to this. Just after doing this with a few songs, a few pieces of music, this is going to be like second nature to you, almost like a visual language, and things just start making a lot of sense. So here, instantly, I see what's going on melodically. Countermelody lines, pad and stuff. So I can very quickly hone in on these sections for various mix decisions, volume fades, that kind of stuff. Maybe bringing effects in and out during key moments when melody parts are coming in, that kind of thing. So now you're seeing how we went from this kind of view in a score, and now we have a lot of visual information in the score itself. And we transferred that way of thinking into the DAW. And I'm not going to do this analysis for this whole piece, but I'll continue for a few more sections. So I'll give this a listen up to where the main melody comes in, starting from around bar 12. So this is now a real electric guitar, whereas prior to that we had these synth guitar leads, which is kind of a good way to segue into the real guitar. And I'm not showing it here, but this lead guitar part is doubled by a synth lead guitar part, and that's not really meant to be an arranging decision. That's more of just to add some additional tonal character to the guitar, and because it's MIDI, it's not exactly in time with the guitar, so it almost acts like a dynamic delay, where sometimes it's really tightly in time with the guitar, sometimes not so tight. Might be a little tough to notice that in the mix, but it just seems to add a certain something. Moving on, so in addition to the melody, there's a countermelody, again in the brass. So the intro got the listener kind of accustomed to these sorts of melodic lines in this brass instrument. So those carry over as a countermelody in this B section. Decent amount of activity in the pads. Then at this point we have bass and drums come in, and I haven't notated the drums, but they're there. So for these initial bars here, we're talking 3 layers. The melody, countermelody, and then this integrated section of pads, bass, drums. So that's what we're seeing here up to around bar 29. It's all this. And again, I'm using color coding so that I can see the pitch ranges here. I can tell which pad is the lowest, which is the highest, which is good to know when you're looking at the high-level architectural view. And then this main melodic idea is about to repeat, and so like I tend to do, and like a lot of arrangers and orchestrators tend to do, during transitions to some new part or to a repeat of a melody within a given part, various sorts of transitions tend to be pretty effective. So in this case I'm using some line, some synth strings and choir, as well as in the piano. And they're very tightly coupled with the countermelody. So in this case, I consider them collectively all one countermelodic layer. And honestly, in terms of arranging, it probably would have been better to drop out this countermelody and just have this idea in the choir and the strings and the piano stand on their own. So during this part here, still 3 layers, melody, then this countermelody integrated well with those riffs. And then the rhythm harmony section of the bass, pads, drums. So that's what we're seeing here. Transition section, and then that takes us to bar 31 where the main theme gets developed a little bit here, and notice at that point these transition lines end. So we'll play up to there, up to around bar 31, starting from around 23. So at bar 31, this is where the melody repeats, and we see it getting doubled up by some synth lead. Otherwise, things stay pretty much the way they were before. But instead of that main theme developing, it abruptly kind of transitions into this C section, into a contrasting section of music. I bring in this additional riff idea in the choir, the synth rings, where we're ending on this ascending kind of idea. Pads drop out there. So again, like I mentioned earlier, it's a good idea when you introduce new ideas to sometimes drop something out to give attention to that new idea. And again, these riffs, like we saw with previous riffs, they're very well integrated with the Countermelody, and so I view them kind of as a unified layer. So we have melody doubled up, Countermelody supported by some riffs, so those are two layers, and then pads and bass as an integrated rhythm harmony section, and drums, of course. And then the C section comes in, and again, transition kind of riffs, those now drop out. And we have some new ideas. So this is kind of like dovetailing. We have this riff idea ending. We introduce a new idea with new articulations, new kind of tonality in the instrument. So here we have these rhythmic kind of synth sounds, along with some bell hits that are also playing a rhythmic kind of harmonic role. And this visualization in the DAW also serves as a great diagnostic kind of tool. For instance, here we are in a new section, and I see that Countermelody and that synth brass is continuing. So from an arranging standpoint, I don't think that's a really good decision on my part. I should have dropped that out to give better contrast to the new ideas that come in. And so in this C section, it's also three layers. In this case, melody, Countermelody, and then the pads, those rhythmic synths, as well as these rhythmic bell hits, drums, as the harmony rhythm section. And then towards the end of that C section, another transition kind of moment to go back to that main section for the B section. So again, the use of transition riffs, as well as doubling up on the main melody with some mallet instruments to emphasize that transition. So during these transition bars, still three layers, in this case melody, Countermelody, plus the riffs that support that, and then the pads, drums, bass. And again, the color coding here matching what we see in here. So we can see very clearly the use of transition kind of riffs, evolution of pads as they grow, diminish. You see the passing around in the arrangement of various instruments on the main melody. That'll become more apparent later on in the piece. So we'll give that a listen to up to this repeat of the B section, up to bar 39, starting from 31.
Didn't we do this yesterday?
I don't know what you mean.
Okay, so we're back at the section B repeat. I'm going to go up to bar around 51 here, the contrasting C section repeat. So here there's a lot of growth in the arrangement, and you can immediately see that in the DAW. The melody is now doubled across as additional synth lead. Sometimes synth strings are picking up on that melody. Pads continuing like they were before in the B section. Again, transitions kind of dropping out to make way for this B section. Countermelody in one instrument. Because we have the main melody being played across three instruments, good arranging technique would typically tell us to also grow one of the other layers, otherwise it might get drowned out. So maybe I should have doubled up this Countermelody part somewhere. As we come to the repeat in this B section of the main melody, I introduce this rhythmic synth, so kind of these pulses going on, just to kind of add some energy, make that transition more prominent. So still we tend to see three layers throughout here, the melody, Countermelody, and then rhythmic synth, bass, drums, pads, integrated rhythm harmony section here. So that's what we're seeing here. Notice how convenient it is to have those melodic parts highlighted, so you can immediately see how the melody is being passed around in the arrangement or the orchestration. And notice here in this pad section, you see a lot more variety of musical functions. Sometimes those pads are really playing pads. Sometimes these pad-like instruments are now playing melody. Likewise, the mallet instruments are becoming more prominent in melodic statements. Now we come to a repeat of this main theme, and I introduce another melodic riff kind of idea, some arpeggios in one of the lead synths, at which point other transition kind of lines drop out so that this is heard more prominently. And again, 3 layers, the melody, countermelody, that arpeggio riff idea along with the bass and pads all sound kind of like an integrated unit. So before I had riffs kind of following the countermelody. Here they're playing more of a rhythm harmony kind of function. I have these accents and some of these hits. So this isn't an exact science. I could have considered this, I could have called this like a pinkish and call it just a riff kind of idea. But I decided it just feels more like a harmony section as opposed to a riff. And then towards the end of this arpeggio idea, we see the countermelody getting a little more active with some riffs supporting it as well. So that might seem like it's too active, too many layers going on. But for the most part, I have these arpeggios active when other parts are not so active. So they kind of let each other breathe. So this is a part of the music that's almost kind of like 4 layers, but for me anyway, the way it's perceived is 3. So the melody, countermelody, which is being integrated with this piano and choir riff, and then that arpeggio riff idea, which is integrated with the overall rhythm harmony section with the bass, pad, drums. And then as we're going back to that C section, we have a riff in the melody that's doubled up in the piano and one of the bells. And then another ascending riff going on, choir and strings, something similar to what we heard before during a transition. And again, pads dropping out to make way for some of these additional ideas here. So this is 3 layers as well, the melody, the countermelody supported by some additional instruments, and then the bass and drums. So we'll give that a listen to up to 51, starting from around bar 39. So we transitioned into the repeat of the C section, and this time it's more energetic than the first go-round of the C section. Now we're seeing some doubling up on the guitar of this pipes synth here. We have more going on with these rhythmic sequence synth kind of sounds. And then this whole section is actually going to wind down to an interlude. So what I'm doing here is really building up a lot of complexity just to make that interlude all the more impactful. So I'm introducing this additional melodic idea that really feels like a second countermelody in addition to the countermelody that we've heard before in the brass. And that new riff idea is happening in a synth guitar part as well as in the piano. These rhythmic sequence synths continue building up rhythmic energy. So I would actually call this truly 4 layers here. A melody, a countermelody, a second countermelody, and then the pads, bass, those rhythmic synths, drums as a separate layer. And then right before this D section, we see things kind of calm down. Melody on a long sustained note, countermelody playing a sustained chord. And then this dreamy synth lead line is just echoing the end of this melodic line here, so it's kind of like a delay. So at that point, things are really quieting down. So we went from more complexity, gradually down to less complexity. And as we're winding down here, it's just 1 or 2 layers because everything's kind of in unison in this sustained note kind of mode. So I'll play that up to this interlude, starting around bar 51. So we saw a lot of evolution going on in the arrangement and in printed notation. If you're experienced with that, that tends to be pretty apparent visually. And now we have the benefit of seeing that in the DAW as well. So we see all the passing around of the melody. We see the variation in how the pads are playing different roles. We see the variation in the pluck kind of instruments. We see the increased use of these rhythmic synth sequences here. And then we see things winding down like I talked about. And now we ultimately see something very different in this interlude. We see that the guitar has dropped out and now the piano is going to become the main instrument. It's going to be a lot of these rhythmic synth kind of lines, a little bit of pads, bass is dropped out, there's some atmospheric percussion going on. We're going back to the score view. Here's the piano playing the main lines, which is the main melodic focus, as well as harmony. It's kind of playing melody and harmony at once. But I'm considering it the main melodic instrument. And here the bells play mainly a melodic role, accentuating the piano melody. Pads coming in and out. Bells continue doing their emphasizing of some melodic notes that are going on in the piano. Energy being built up in these rhythmic synths. Percussion getting more active. Everything getting a little more active because this section is leading up to the outro solo. And then right as this section is ending, the piano part is no longer playing that main melodic role because I've introduced these synth guitars, which is a good way to segue into the real guitar solo that's about to come up. So at that point, various instruments are kind of playing along. It's not obviously apparent that these are really playing a melodic role. I just happen to know that in these melodic lines here, there's a lot of C and D notes, and those notes are also being echoed here, and these bell kind of hits. The piano is in more of a rhythmic support kind of role, as well as these rhythmic synths, percussion more and more active. And towards the end, those melodic lines get more and more active. So there's more melodic energy, more rhythmic energy going on here. Everything just building up to that outro. And I'm not going to talk about the outro. The outro is basically a solo over a repeat of the B and C section. There aren't any new arranging or orchestration ideas I want to show you. So now I'll play the interlude right up until the outro section. Alright, so that concludes this video. I guess in 30 minutes we covered a ludicrous amount of territory, but hopefully you're starting to appreciate what this technique can do for you. The visualization, total control of your musical elements in the DAW, just like professional arrangers and orchestrators do, using standard musical notation to guide them. In the next videos in this series, I'll go more in depth into very specific arranging and orchestration tips. The next video will be specifically on arranging the low end. So stay tuned for that. Until next time.